Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 16, the imperfect in the weak verbs. Now, in the last chapter, we learned about the imperfect in the strong verb category. In this chapter, we're going to learn about the imperfect and how the imperfect conjugation appears in a number of different weak verb categories. Now, you should know from the beginning that this is one of the more substantial chapters in the grammar, meaning that there's a lot of information here. When I teach this course, I divide this chapter in half and teach it over an entire week. In our normal course of events, we'll cover 2 chapters in a week. But when we hit chapter 16, we take the whole week for it. So you don't want to be discouraged by the amount of information that you encounter in this lecture. You can pause the lecture, and then you can move on when you feel comfortable with the material. We've divided the workbook exercises into 6 different categories. So you'll have the opportunity to learn something about a weak verb and practice that in the workbook in the discrete category. So we've provided plenty of information in the workbook to reinforce all that you're going to encounter here. So let's get started. Look at your screens with me. We're going to begin with the spelling of 2 guttural and 3rd chet ayin verbs. Gutturals prefer A-type vowels. You already know this. Because of this preference, the stem vowel in 2 guttural and 3rd chet ayin verbs is pathic, not holem as in the strong verb paradigm. Look at the 2 examples. Yivchar, Yishlech. In each example, the stem vowel is pathic and it's highlighted in red. The reason that the stem vowel is pathic, A-class vowel, is because of the guttural in the 3rd root position or in the 2nd root position. Gutturals prefer A-class vowels, and as such, the guttural will take the A-class stem vowel. A second type of change that will occur with these verbs appears under the 2nd root letter when you would normally expect vocal schwa in your paradigm form. Look at your screen with me. You already know that gutturals cannot take vocal schwa, something we've learned a long time ago. However, they do take the reduced vowel, the hatef vowel. In 2 guttural verbs, therefore, the vocal schwa changes to hatef pathic in the 2 FS, 3 MP, and 2 MP forms. Each of those forms is illustrated on your screen. Tivchari, Yivcharu, Tivcharu. In each instance, you'll see that the expected vocal schwa under the 2nd root letter has changed slightly to hatef pathic because of the guttural in the 2nd root position. Now, you've seen this type of change in nouns and in perfect weak verbs. You're going to see it again now in the imperfect weak verb. You shouldn't be surprised, and this shouldn't cause any difficulty with identification. You already know that this is a normal feature in the language. You can now see on your screen the full paradigms for the 2 guttural and 3rd chet ayin categories. We've also included the strong verb paradigm for comparison. You will observe that the inflectional pattern in the 2 guttural and 3rd chet ayin categories don't provide any substantial changes that would preclude you from identifying each form in its context. You simply need to realize that the stem vowel has shifted to A-class and that you'll sometimes see the hatef pathic where you would normally see the schwa. All of those changes are highlighted in red. And if you don't see a lot of red on the page, that's because there aren't that many changes to see. The next category of weak verb that we will cover is the 3rd aleph category. Look at your screen with me. Most of the changes that take place in the imperfect of this weak verb class result from the fact that the aleph in the 3rd root position is quiescent or silent, something we already know about. This quiescent aleph causes the stem vowel to change from pathic to comets in most of the forms of the paradigm. Now, this is the exact same thing that happened in the perfect 3rd aleph category, and so it's also happening in the imperfect 3rd aleph category. It's nothing new to learn, you're just seeing it applied to a different context. Look at your screen with me. The examples at the bottom of the page. Yimtza, Timtza, Emtza. In each case, the stem vowel is comets. This is due to the fact that the aleph is quiescent. Therefore, the stem vowel has lengthened from pathic to comets. And the stem vowel is A-class because aleph is a guttural, and gutturals prefer A-class vowels. One other feature that you need to be aware of with the 3rd aleph verbs you'll see on your screen. The identical 3FP and 2FP forms exhibit a slight unexpected Segol stem vowel. This variation is unusual in terms of what you might normally expect but it should pose no difficulty for the identification of these forms. Why? Because the preformative and subformatives remain unchanged. The only difference is the stem vowel is shifted from an A class to an E class. We can now look together on your screen at the entire paradigm for the third Aleph weak verb class. You'll see that the stem vowel has changed to the A class, and it's the long A comets because of the quiescent Aleph. In the twin 3FP and 2FP forms, you get the Segol stem vowel. The fact that the Aleph is quiescent and that the stem vowel is comets is a factor already known to you from the Cal Perfect weak verbs. We're taking something you already know and applying it to a different context, reinforcing what you know, but expanding that knowledge. You don't need to memorize this paradigm. You simply need to learn the types of changes you'll see. Our next weak verb category is the third He weak verb. Third He. Look at your screen with me. Imperfect third He verbs have the Segol He ending in those forms without a subformative. Look at the screen with me. Yivneh, Evneh. 5 imperfect forms do not have subformatives. 5 imperfect verbs do have subformatives. In those 5 perfect verbs that do not have subformatives, each imperfect verb will end in Segol He. This Segol He is diagnostic of the third He weak verb class. Now in those forms that do take a subformative, the Segol He drops out. Look at your screen. Imperfect third He verbs with a subformative don't have the final He. That He drops out. Your examples, Yivnu, Tivnu. You see the imperfect preformative, you see the imperfect subformative. You see the first 2 verbal roots, bait and noon. You do not see the third verbal root, the He. That He has dropped out in the inflection of this form. When parsing these forms, you'll need to be able to reconstruct the verbal root. You'll need to be able to replace the He by reconstructing its original form. A second feature of third He verbs occurs in the twin 3FP and 2FP forms. Look at your screen with me. The identical 3FP and 2FP forms exhibit a Segol Yod stem vowel. This variation is unusual but should pose no difficulty for the identification of these forms. First, you'll recall from our lecture in the perfect, third He verbs were originally third Yod. That Yod will frequently reappear when the verb is inflected. In these twin forms, 3FP and 2FP, the original Yod reappears as the vowel Segol Yod. If you can recognize the fact that the Segol Yod represents the original third He root letter, then you'll be able to reconstruct these verbs. No need to memorize, simply understand the morphology. You'll now see on your screen the full paradigm for the third He verbs. In those 5 instances where the imperfect verb does not take a subformative, you will see the Segol He ending. 3MS, 3FS, 2MS, 1CS, and 1CP. Let me say these verbal forms for you so you can hear the Segol He ending. Yivneh, Tivneh, Tivneh, Evneh, Nivneh. In those 5 forms, the Segol He identifies this particular weak verb as third He. It's an easy identification to make. However, in those 5 verbal forms that do take a subformative, the He is dropped off. Look at your screen again. In the 2FS, the 3MP, the 3FP, the 2MP, and the 2FP, the He has dropped off. In the 3FP and 2FP, you have the Segol Yod stem vowel that is diagnostic of this third He weak verb class. In the remaining 3 forms, there's nothing to diagnose the form as third He, and you'll have to work from context, having memorized your vocabulary like a robot. Let's now move to the spelling of one guttural verbs. This particular category is a little more tricky because there are 2 options. We're going to talk about type 1 and type 2 one guttural verbs. Look at your screen with me. Based on their stem vowels, there are 2 types of one guttural weak verbs in the imperfect. Type 1 verbs have a pathic stem vowel, a Segol preformative vowel, and a Hatef Segol under the guttural consonant in the first root position. So it's E vowel, E vowel, A vowel. Look at the example, Yechazech. In this example, you will see a Segol under the Yod, the preformative consonant. You'll see a Hatef Segol under the Chet, the first root letter, and then you'll see a pathic stem vowel. This is the first spelling pattern for the type 1 one-guttural. But there's also a second spelling pattern, a type 2. Type 2 verbs have a holum stem vowel, a pathic preformative vowel, and a hatef pathic under the guttural consonant in first root position. Look at the example on your page, ya'amoth. You will see that when you compare the two examples, the bottom example, ya'amoth, has a different vocalization. It's A-A-O, not E-E-A. Again, the bottom example begins with a pathic or short A vowel under the preformative consonant yod. Under the first root letter, you have the hatef pathic vowel. Then your stem vowel is holum. These two patterns for the one guttural must be learned. Let's look at the paradigms together on your screen. You will see presented together the one guttural type 1 and the one guttural type 2. You will see that in each category, they follow the pattern presented in the previous slide. That is, in the one guttural type 1, you will see the sagol vowel as the preformative vowel, the hatef sagol under the first root letter, and the pathic stem vowel throughout where it does not reduce. Likewise, in the one guttural type 2 category, you have the pathic preformative vowel, the hatef pathic under the first root letter, and the holum stem vowel. In Hebrew, you simply had two different options for inflecting these verbs, and you see them now on your screen. Now, you don't necessarily need to memorize these paradigms because all of the imperfect sopformatives and preformatives are maintained. There's a slight different vocalization at the preformative level, but as long as you know the preformative consonant and you can identify with it the sopformative, you should have no difficulty in identifying the person, gender, and number of these imperfect verbs. It will take some time, but if you work with it and you learn to understand the rules behind the morphology, you will have success in the language. A subcategory of a one guttural verb is the one aleph verb. Look at your screen. There are two types of one aleph verbs in the imperfect. The type 1 class inflects like the type 1 class of one guttural verbs. Look at the example, ye'asor. So for this particular example, you don't need to memorize anything new. It's just like the regular type 1. But the type 2 one aleph verb is distinctly different. Type 2 verbs of the one aleph class have a holum preformative vowel and a pathic stem vowel. The aleph is quiescent in each form of the paradigm, which means there will be no vowel under the aleph. Look at the example, yomar. Let's now look at the type 2 paradigm on your screen together. You will notice in the type 2 category the unique spelling of this one aleph verb. You don't need to worry about the type 1 category because in the type 1 category, that's spelled just like the regular type 1 one guttural. In the type 2 one aleph, the spelling is distinct. Yomar, Tomar, Tomar, Tomri, Omar. In each case, the aleph is quiescent, but pay special attention to the 1CS category. In this particular instance, you have the aleph of the preformative and the aleph of the verbal root being written only once, Omar. Let me demonstrate for you how this works. I'm going to write on my screen what you might expect to see, the inflected form with two alephs. Now you already know that Hebrew does not like to have two identical consonants back to back in a particular word. For this reason, Hebrew will simplify the double aleph by writing it as a single aleph. You'll also observe that in the pronunciation there is no difference. The first example is pronounced like this, Omar. The second example is pronounced the same, Omar. There is no difference in pronunciation, there's simply a difference in spelling. And that spelling difference is occasioned by the fact that in Hebrew they don't like to write two identical consonants together, so they simplify. And in this case you can't add a dogish forte to represent the fact that the two consonants should go together because the aleph is a guttural and gutturals reject the dogish forte. Now we'll move to geminate verbs. Look at your screen with me. First you'll observe that there are two types of geminate verbs, just like there were two types of one aleph verbs. In the type 1 category, the cal imperfect geminate verbs have a holum stem vowel and either a comet or a here preformative vowel. Look at the two examples. There is yasov and yissov. you'll see that they have different preformative vowels, comets in the first example and Herrick in the second example. Additionally, the first example does not have a doggish forte in the first root letter, but the second example does have a doggish forte. In the type 2 category, the cal imperfect geminate verb will have a pathic stem vowel and a seri-preformative vowel, or vocal schwa in the 2-FP forms. Look at the example, ye tham, ye tham. Now let's look at the entire paradigm together. Because of the variation in the paradigms that you'll see on this screen, we want to focus only on geminate type 1. The alternate type 1 and the geminate type 2 occur with much less frequency, and so they're not as important to focus on right now. In time, you'll begin to see that they do occur and that you do want to have some familiarity with how they work. But for now, we must begin by building a baseline, and that baseline is the geminate type 1. Look at your screen with me. Here you will notice that with geminate type 1 verbs, the preformative vowel is comets in every form except the 3-FP and the 2-FP, and in those cases, it reduces to vocal schwa due to propretonic reduction. Secondly, you'll notice that the geminate twins no longer exist as twins. In those forms without a sufformative, the twin geminate consonant has dropped off. In those 5 forms that do not take an imperfect sufformative, the geminate consonant has simply dropped off and it is no longer represented in any way. In the 5 forms that do take preformatives, the geminate consonant has dropped off, but it's reappeared as the doggish forte in the original geminate consonant. So here you can see, you can identify a geminate verb in the imperfect with 2 clues. Number 1, the pathic preformative vowel, and number 2, the doggish forte in the original geminate consonant in the 5 forms that maintain it. In those forms that do not maintain it, you'll have to rely on the comet stem vowel. In our next category of weak verb, we'll cover the biconsonantal verbs. Now you know from our study of perfect verbs that biconsonantal verbs are verbs that have only 2 root letters, and you memorize them in their lexical form as the infinitive construct. And the infinitive construct form distinguishes between certain biconsonantal verbs by that medial vowel letter. Some verbs are U-class, exhibiting the Shurik medial vowel letter. Some verbs are I-class, exhibiting the Herrick Yod medial vowel letter. And some verbs are O-class, exhibiting the Holam Wow medial vowel letter. Look at your screen with me. Here you will see presented the perfect, the imperfect, and the lexical entry for biconsonantal weak verbs, classified by the Shurik, the Herrick Yod, or the Holam Wow medial vowel letter. Now, as you recall from your study of the cal perfect, you'll know that that medial vowel letter does not appear in any of the perfect forms. In the cal imperfect, however, that medial vowel letter is present in every form. And that's good news because it makes identification simpler. That is to say, you've memorized the lexical form as cum or seam or bow, and that full form with the medial vowel letter occurs in each inflected imperfect form with the appropriate preformatives or sufformatives. Thus, if you've memorized your lexical form properly, you should have little trouble identifying the imperfect form of biconsonantal verbs. Let's look at your screen together. In all forms except the 3-FP and 2-FP, and in each of the 3 classes, I, O, and U, the preformative vowel is comets. That's one important feature. Secondly, the stem vowel in each form is determined by the biconsonantal subclass, either Shurik or Herrick Yod or Holam Wow. So those are going to be the 2 distinguishing features of the biconsonantal class, a comet stem vowel and a distinct medial vowel letter. With this information, we can now look at the full paradigm for each of these 3 verbs with cum and seam and bow. They're presented on your screen, and you will see that in each category, the medial vowel letter is a prominent feature in the inflection of each form. In the cum or Shurik class, yakum, takum, takum, takumi, akum, you will see the comet's preformative vowel and the Shurik medial vowel letter. Look in the Herrick Yod class or the verb seam, yasim, tasim, tasim, tasimi, asim. You will see that you have the same comet's preformative vowel, but in this case, the Herrick Yod stem vowel that you've memorized as a part of its lexical form. Let's finally go to the O class, or the whole and wild class, with bow. Yavo, tavo, tavo, tavo-e, avo. You'll quickly recognize that once again, you can see the comma's preformative vowel in each case, and the medial vowel letter is whole and wow. It's that medial vowel letter that you've memorized in the lexical form, reappearing now here. So if you've memorized your vocabulary, like you should with the infinitive construct form, identification of the imperfect of these weak verbs should present no problem to you. The preformative vowel is comets. The preformative consonant is the same. The subformatives are all identical to the strong verb. What you have to do is leverage what you know against what is new in order to determine what these weak verbs are doing when they change their form slightly. If you memorize the imperfect paradigm of the strong verb like a robot, and you know the morphology behind these weak verb classes, then you don't have to memorize these paradigms. You memorize one paradigm and you understand the morphology. Now you can see that so far we've encountered a lot of verbs, and there's been a lot of changes in these verbs. But the changes are governed by relatively few rules. If you'll just continue to work with me and develop those rules in your mind and apply them to the verb system, then you won't be bogged down by paradigm memorization. And at the end of the day, you'll see that Hebrew is a consistent system that works with only a few rules, applying them regularly. The next category of weak verb that we want to cover is the one-yod weak verb category. Now in the perfect, the one-yod category is not weak. That's because we're not adding anything to the front of the verb. We only add things to the end, and it doesn't affect the yod too much. In the imperfect, we're adding something not only to the ending, but also to the beginning. And the more you add to a verb, the more changes that you can encounter. So in the imperfect category, the one-yod verb is weak. Take a look at your screen with me. With type 1 cal imperfect one-yod verbs, the first consonant of the verbal root drops in every form, and the preformative vowel is sere. The stem vowel is variable between sere and pathic. With type 2 cal imperfect one-yod verbs, the initial yod of the verbal root is seemingly preserved as the vowel letter hirik yod, and then the stem vowel is pathic. Let's look together at the paradigms for each of these verbs. First, let's begin with the type 1 category. With type 1 verbs, you'll observe that the yod root letter is lost in every form. The subformatives are preserved, and the preformatives are preserved. The distinguishing factor for the type 1 one-yod verb is the sere preformative vowel in every form. This distinctive preformative vowel will identify this particular weak verb class as one yod, and you'll be able to properly reconstruct the verbal root when you know this factor. That is to say, when you encounter a verb in the type 1 class, you'll see a preformative and a subformative, and then you'll only see two root letters. You'll be able to derive or reconstruct the third root letter, like your Hebrew CSI skills will give you, by identifying the fact or by recognizing the fact that the sere preformative vowel is the diagnostic feature. It's the DNA of the one-yod type 1 class. If you'll remember this, you won't have to memorize the paradigm. You'll know that the one-yod verb in the type 1 category loses the first root consonant, but it's identifiable by the sere preformative vowel. Let's look now together at the type 2 class. The type 2 class. In the type 2 class, you'll see that the yod root letter is seemingly preserved, but not as a consonant. It now appears as a vowel, hirik yod. You'll see that following the preformative consonant, yod, tau, aleph, or nun, is the hirik yod. That hirik yod will help you to identify this as one yod. That is, the yod is preserved not as a consonant, but in this case as a vowel. That doesn't matter one way or another whether it's a consonant or a vowel to you, but when you see the yod there, you can say that's a one-yod verb, and you'll properly identify the verbal root. You will observe as you study this paradigm in the type 2 category, all of the preformatives and subformatives are maintained. Additionally, you will see all three root letters. The first root letter, however, is simply converted to hirik yod. There's one other thing that we need to talk about before we move on from the one-yod class, and that's the verb halak. The verb halak is a little bit tricky. The verb halak is technically a one-guttural verb. It has a hey in the first root position. But I guess the verb halak didn't like its verb class, and so it shifted. It went to the other team. The verb halak inflects not like a one-guttural, but like a one-yod. Let's look at our screen together once again. You will see sandwiched between the type 1 and the type 2 paradigms, the paradigm for the verb halak. you'll notice that in every form of that verbal paradigm, the hey has dropped out. You will observe that in every form of the paradigm, the hey has dropped out. Additionally, you'll see that the vocalization pattern for the verb halak is exactly like the type 1 one-yod weak verb. So you will need to, in your mind, connect the verb halak not with the one guttural category, but with the one yod category, type 1. If you don't do that, it'll be difficult for you to reconstruct the verbal root halak. Now, the verb halak in Hebrew is one of those common verbs. And that which is most common? That's right, it's most irregular. And this is one of those features of the language where you have one verb acting like another type of verb. The verb halak inflects like the one yod type 1 weak verb. Now let's move to our next weak verb, the one noon weak verb. Now again, in the Cal perfect, the one noon verb was not weak. But in the imperfect, because you're adding something to the beginning of the verb, now the one noon category becomes weak. And so we need to take some time to discuss the one noon category. Look at your screen with me. There are two types of one noon verbs. Let's begin with type 1. Type 1 verbs have a holum stem vowel, and type 2 verbs have a pathic stem vowel. In every form of the type 1 and in most forms of the type 2, the initial root consonant noon has assimilated into the second root consonant, and it's represented as a dogish forte. Now let me say this again for you. You already know from your study previously in the nouns that the noon consonant is a weak consonant. You know that the noon consonant likes to assimilate, and it will appear in other consonants as a dogish forte. That happens again with verbs, and in the imperfect, in the one noon category, you're going to see it happen. Let's look again at your examples. Let's look at the first example together. Yip pol, yip pol. In this particular example, you can see the preformative yod hirik. You can also see the second and third root letter, pei and lamed. What's happened, however, is that the noon of the verbal root has been lost. It's been assimilated, but it's not totally gone. The noon is assimilated, and now you can see it represented in the pei as a dogish forte. So the way in which you'll identify and properly reconstruct this verbal root as one noon is recognizing that the dogish forte in the pei, or the second root consonant, represents the assimilated noon of the verbal root. Let's look together at the second example, yissa, yissa. The only difference between yip pol and yissa is the stem vowel. In the first example, you have a holum stem vowel. In the second example, you have the pathic stem vowel. The issue is, what causes the stem vowel to convert to pathic in our second example? And it's this. You will observe that this verb has an ion or a guttural in the third root position. Gutturals prefer A-class vowels. Because of that, the stem vowel changes from the O-class holum to the A-class ion. This is something you've already experienced. Now understand with me this. You have already encountered both morphological features that cause the weaknesses in this verb. You've seen an assimilating noon, and you've seen stem vowels change from O to A based upon the fact that it appears with a guttural consonant. So there's nothing new to learn in this particular class of weak verb. You're simply applying what you already know to a new environment. Now let's look at your screen once again and look at one more example of a one noon verb. One noon verbs that are also two guttural, we could call that doubly weak. Why? Because there are two weak root letters, so it's doubly weak. So one noon verbs that are also two guttural retain the noon in the first root position. The expected assimilation does not occur because the second root consonant is a guttural, which cannot take a dogish forte. So understand with me the fact that this weak verb will not assimilate the noon because of the guttural in second root position. You know that the gutturals don't like to take the dogish forte, and so rather than simply drop out, the noon just decides to stay around. Now this is good news because now in these forms you can see all three root letters. You can see the noon in first root position, the guttural in second root position, and whatever happens to be in the third root position. The fact that this particular word takes an A-class stem vowel is simply due to the fact that the word has a guttural in the second root position. So in some sense, this particular weak verb that's doubly weak maintains its strong features. Now you can look with me at the paradigms for these one noon verbs. There's the type 1 category, the type 2 category, and the doubly weak category. In the type 1 category, the noon is assimilated in every instance, and it reappears as a dogish forte in the second consonant of the verbal root, in this case, pei. So the paradigm is pronounced yip pol, tip poli, et pol, etc. I'm only pronouncing 2 root letters. All of the imperfect preformatives and all of the imperfect subformatives are the same. You can reconstruct this verbal root simply by recognizing that the dogish forte in the second root letter represents the assimilated noon. In the type 2 category on your screen, you'll observe all of the same features except for the A-class stem vowel. This A-class stem vowel stems from the fact, no pun intended, that the guttural in the third root position prefers the A-class vowel. Then in your third category, or your third column, the doubly weak one noon verb, it actually looks more like a strong verb. The double weakness in this particular verb preserves the noon in first root position, and so identification is super easy. No problem there. Once again, we're taking everything that you know about verbs and applying it to a new situation. There's really nothing new for you to learn on the paradigms we've just looked at in the one noon category. The one noon weak verb is the last weak verb category that we're going to cover in this chapter. Now, it may seem like a lot of information at this point, but we're done with all of the different weak verbs. This chapter will take some time to assimilate into your brain and become usable information, but it's important to take that time. Once you master the weak verb features in this chapter, the remaining chapters in the Cal STEM will present no problem for you because there will be almost no new information to encounter. So spend a good amount of time in this chapter, double what you would spend in any other chapter. However, before we conclude, I want to conclude by discussing a very important feature of the imperfect weak verb category, especially as it relates to identifying weak verbal roots where one of the verbal roots is lost. That is, in a number of different weak verbal roots, only 2 root letters will remain, not 3. You will have to reconstruct that third root letter. In order to do that, we need to work on our Hebrew CSI skills. Look at your screen with me now. You will see 4 different weak verb classes: third hey, one yod, one noon, and geminate. What relates each of these different weak verbal classes to the other is the fact that there are only 2 root letters that appear in each of the inflected forms. So in the third hey category, the regular hey of the verbal root is lost, and in those forms without a sufformative, it reappears as segol hey, something slightly different. In those 5 forms that do take a sufformative, the hey is entirely lost. In the one yod type 1 weak verb class, the yod in first root position is lost in every form. In the one noon type 1 weak verb class, the noon is lost and assimilated as a dogish forte in every form. Finally, in the geminate weak verb class, the final or second geminate consonant is lost in every form. So here we have a number of weak verbs that have 3 root letters, but only 2 of them appear in their inflected form. So how do we distinguish between these different conjugations, or how do we properly reconstruct the correct verbal root? Is it third hey, one noon, one yod, geminate? Here are the clues. You don't need to memorize the paradigms. You need to understand the morphology that demonstrates which weak verb class they belong to, and therefore what root letter to reconstruct. Look at your screen with me now, and you will see the important clues to focus on as you study this chapter. Number 1, with third hey verbs, the 5 forms without a sufformative end in segol hey. That segol hey will identify the third hey weak verb class. The identical 3FP and 2FP forms have the unchangeable long vowel segol yod as the stem vowel. This is the most common weak verb class, that is third hey verbs, and so this is an important weak verb class to focus on. The segol yod stem vowel in the twin 3FP and 2FP forms will remind you that third hey verbs were originally third yod. Number 2, with one yod verbs and the verb halak, which inflects like a one yod verb, the preformative vowel is sere. In the Cal stem, only one yod verbs and a few geminate type 2 verbs, which don't occur that often, have this sere preformative vowel. So when you see a weak imperfect verb with only 2 root letters and the stem vowel is sere, you can properly reconstruct the verbal root by recognizing that the sere stem vowel is diagnostic of the one yod weak verb category. You put the yod back into the root and you've got your verb. Let's look together now at number 3. With one noon verbs and the verb lakak, which inflects like a one noon verb, the verbal root can be identified by the dogish forte in the second consonant of every form. This Dagesh forte represents the assimilated noon of a one noon verb or the assimilated lamed of the verb lakach. Now here's the thing. This is what distinguishes the one noon category from the other categories. It's the Dagesh forte in the second root letter. Now when you see the inflected form, the Dagesh forte will appear as if it's in the first root letter, but that's because the first root letter has really disappeared. So when you see a preformative and the following letter has the Dagesh forte in it, you can assume that that's an assimilated noon and properly reconstruct the verbal root. Let's look at number 4 together. With geminate verbs, a Dagesh forte will appear in the geminate consonant of those 5 forms that take a sufformative, as in yasobu. In those forms without a sufformative, the commas preformative vowel distinguishes this weak verb class from the other weak verb classes that have only 2 root letters in their inflected forms. So it's very important that you take some time to study the 4 weak verbs together in their paradigms that exhibit the loss of a root letter in its inflected form. You don't want to memorize those paradigms. What you want to do is you want to work through the forms in each paradigm, and you want to say to yourself, what identifies this form as belonging to this weak verb class? Is there a Dagesh forte in a geminate consonant? Is there a Dagesh forte in a consonant that represents an assimilated noon? Is there a steri preformative vowel? Is there a commas preformative vowel? Those features will help you reconstruct the verbal root, and you'll be a good Hebrew CSI member. Well, that concludes our lecture for chapter 16. It's perhaps the most complicated and the most difficult chapter in the Cal Stim, but once you master the material, you'll be good to go for the remaining chapters.